The permafrost tasted like metal in my mouth when I dug my gloved hands into it for the first time. I told myself I was trained for this. I had protocols, permits, and a clipboard full of data sheets that reeked of bureaucracy and false assurance. The sky was a hard, indifferent gray, and the wind hit my face like a slap, but none of that prepared me for the way the ground held its breath. Every scoop of frozen muck felt obscene, as if I were unzipping a wound the land had been stapling shut for decades. We were a small team, the kind of ragged professionalism that thrives on caffeine and denial. I was supposed to be methodical, drill, bag, label, freeze. Instead, my hands trembled as I labeled a sample site B13 and watched frost accumulate on the ink. It was late on the fourth day when my drill bit clinked against something that wasn't stone. There was a hollow sound that stole the rhythm from my chest. For a second I envisioned an animal trapped and flailing beneath, and then the bit came out with bone-white fragments clinging to the threads. I remember the absurd thought, this can't be. Archaeology takes permits and press releases, not the breathless, private fear that rose in me like bile. I reported it to Sandra, the field lead, who wore her anger like a thermal layer. She told me to bag everything, seal it double, and mark the coordinates. Chain of custody, she said with the low, flat voice of someone who had practiced calm until it could be measured. Her eyes flicked to the fragments and then away, as if looking longer would crack some code between us. We found personal items, a child's mitten with a campaign button stuck in the wool, a cheap wristwatch stopped at $3.17, a half-melted plastic lighter with a sticker from a brand still sold in convenience stores. They were too recent to belong to some remote, forgotten history. They smelled like rubber and expired cigarettes, ordinary things that should have made sense and instead gave my stomach a new language of dread. That night I couldn't sleep. In the small mesh of the tent, the heater coughed and the world outside was an ocean of ice that made every sound thin and absolute. My mind circled the fragments like a scavenger hawk. I began to replay missing person cases I had read in the service room back home, names with faces blurred by poor photocopies, press releases that always ended with a polite, numbed hope. What if those lists and the coordinates we recorded crossed a line no official wanted to acknowledge? The rational part of me mapped excuses, sinkhole, undocumented travel, a hunter's misfortune. The irrational part nodded into an animal panic that tasted like cold iron, the idea that the permafrost had been keeping more than artifacts quiet. In the morning, the lab sent a courier with a pallet of sterile boxes and a man whose face was too familiar from the legal notices we'd been given: don't disturb unmarked remains, notify authorities, document all chain of custody. He moved with the precise, quiet brutality of someone used to turning human stories into spreadsheets. He opened one sealed bag and his jaw tightened so it matched a serrated edge. "We need more samples," he said, but his voice had the flat panic of a man reading bad weather reports. He asked me whether I had noticed anything odd in the nights before the find. I lied. I said nothing. The truth was that my dreams had started to smell like diesel and bleach, and sometimes in the dark I could swear I heard a transmission carried across the ice, fragmentary words that might have been names, might have been coordinates, might have been nothing but the wind playing tricks on a man who had already learned to fear what he didn't have the vocabulary for. I told myself to treat it like science, and for a while that mantra acted as armor. We expanded the grid, widened the transects, logged GPS points until the maps looked like constellations stitched by a clumsy hand. Every new hole we bored yielded the same sickening pattern: clothing fibers embedded in silt, modern plastics creased by frost, bones that weren't withered into the softened anonymity of deep time but were sharp, recent, as if someone had been interred yesterday and frozen into stasis. My gloves left bloody smears I had to scrub off in the communal sink, and each time the warm water fogged with the smell of damp cloth and old coffee, a kind of domestic grotesque I couldn't scrub away. Questions multiplied like mold. Who had walked this route and disappeared between checkpoints? How did a person vanish from roads tracked by satellites and trucks tracked by GPS and surfaces that creak under the feet of other humans? The more I sought straightforward answers, the more the space between facts and possibility stretched into something that ate at the light. I began reading case files at night, the kind of coroner notes you hope you never have to parse. Last seen, no signs of struggle, inadequate leads. The words blurred until they became a mantra of absence. I scribbled names in the margins of my notebook, and sometimes, when the tent was too quiet, I whispered them aloud just to prove I could still form consonants. One afternoon, a phone call from HQ shoved my chest into my throat. They wanted everything cataloged but asked that we minimize media exposure, a diplomatic phrase that smells like paper bags and hands that clap over mouths. They sent a legal advisor by helicopter to speak with Sandra in whispers that shivered like icicles. After that meeting, Sandra's face hollowed. She started to move faster, to speak in shorter sentences. Her authority curdled into something brittle. She told us to keep working, to accelerate recovery, but there was a new urgency in it that read like panic in a suit. I watched her at night, standing at the tent flap and watching the horizon until the sun folded into a bruise. Once she turned and said, "Some things freeze and keep their business," and for the first time I heard fear in her tone that wasn't ironclad protocol. I began to notice patterns in the debris, certain brands, certain model years of watches, a cluster of items traced back to the same county far to the south. The threads connected to a human map I couldn't ignore: transient workers, seasonal laborers, travelers who slipped off the rails between overstretched services and winter storms. It made a pit form in my ribs to think how invisible those lives could become. The land did not distinguish a tourist's backpack from a worker's duffel. It only held them, slow and indifferent, in a geometry of cold that erased context. At night, the idea metastasized into a monstrous logic. The permafrost was not an otherworldly crypt but an impartial vault where bureaucracy and neglect could bury a person without witnesses who mattered. Sometimes I convinced myself the horror was my projection, my work forcing narratives onto scraps. Other times there were clues that refused to be tidy. A name embroidered into a child's mitten matched a missing person report from 2 summers prior. A serial number on a lighter matched a purchase receipt filed with unemployment benefits. Each match pulled at the seam between coincidence and culpability. I found myself replaying conversations with small-town clerks in my head, trying to parse whether their curt replies were ignorance or complicity. My notes accumulated, marginalia growing into a ledger of suspicion. The fear was not the scream of something supernatural. It was the slow, precise arithmetic of administrative failure adding up to a human cost. One night, unable to sleep, I walked alone out beyond the perimeter, breaking trail into a field of old frost polygons that winked under the aurora. The air was so thin it felt like walking through glass. I knelt and pressed my gloved palm to the snow and felt the instant cold transfer as if the ground was answering me with its own pulse. For a moment I imagined it returning whispers, names, apologies, coordinates, but there were only the mechanical sounds of the world, a distant engine, the murmur of the tent heaters, my own breath loud as a confession. Still, the idea had lodged inside me like a burr. Something terrible could be true without being fantastic. The horror lived in human systems failing their weakest people, and the evidence was patient, literal, waiting under a skin of ice until some fool with a drill pulled it open. The morning the coroner flew in, the cold felt surgical. He moved through our grid with a calm that was almost obscene, all practiced detachment and clipboard etiquette, but his gloved hands trembled once when he lifted a child's sneaker and turned it palm up as if searching for a pulse that would never answer. They cataloged, photographed, labeled, turning flesh and fiber into numbers for a file I imagined being boxed and shelved under fluorescent lights. The paperwork multiplied like frost crystals, crystalline and precise, and each line made the nameless bodies into evidence, which was at once a relief and another kind of violence. Then there was the phone call that ripped the last thin veil from me. A clerk in a distant county read off names while I scribbled like a man trying to outrun a storm. People we pulled from the ground matched missing person reports that had been filed and then neglected, cases downgraded to wandered off, misclassified as voluntary absence, closed for lack of resources. A mother had listed her son's description and been told to call back if he didn't return in a week. That bureaucratic shrug echoed in my head with a sound like ice breaking. It wasn't ghosts or monsters hiding in the permafrost, it was paperwork and indifference, an empire of small neglects building itself into catastrophe. I wanted to be angry at the land for keeping secrets, but anger needed a face, a will. Instead, I found the face of fear reflected in government emails and corporate memos, edits that soften language, directives to avoid speculation, the kind of euphemisms that make the dead into problems to be managed. Sandra read the coroner's preliminary report with her hands clenched so tight her knuckles glowed white beneath the nylon. She accused no one, she only folded and refolded the same phrase under her breath, chain of custody, as though repeating it might stitch the rupture closed. The legal advisor, who had been all quiet efficiency, now moved with the flinty kindness of a man who knew how to keep things from exploding outside neat rooms. We held a meeting where the words public relations were spoken like a ritual. Someone argued for a press release emphasizing ongoing research and commitment to community. Someone else worried about lawsuits and funding. I felt my stomach curdle as if I had ingested something rancid. The victims were becoming variables. The horror was not the presence of bodies but the way absence had been administratively rendered unremarkable until the ice unearthed what paperwork had allowed to vanish. I could picture the lists, closed cases, misfiled reports, calls logged by tired operators who had learned to triage despair. When the autopsies returned, the biology matched the paperwork's indictment. Causes of death were varied: exposure, accidents, undiagnosed conditions, but the common denominator was negotiation, between people and systems, between those who had mobility and means and those who did not. These weren't ancient secrets revealed by some malevolent Arctic will, they were fresh mistakes and slow violences, missed welfare checks, frozen out reporting, roads that ended without warning. The permafrost had been an accomplice only in the sense that it kept evidence intact. The real perpetrator was the network of neglect that allowed people to become invisible. I spent the final days packing crates labeled with coordinates, inventory numbers, and the kind of bureaucratic neatness that pretends to repair. At night I walked the area alone and tried to imagine each person as a whole life rather than a line item. Faces I had only known through scatters of cloth returned in my head with arguments and jokes I invented to make them human again. I thought of the mother who'd been told to wait, of the clerks whose tiredness had calcified into indifference, of the companies and agencies that prioritized optics over outreach. My fears shifted into a colder clarity. The horror had always been comprehensible, possible, and preventable. On my last night I lay awake listening to the tense seams creak and the distant, mechanical heartbeat of a generator. I understood then what had frightened me from the start, not the idea that the land kept secrets, but that people had become small enough to be secreted away by their own systems. The permafrost had simply preserved the truth until we could no longer pretend it wasn't there. I left the site carrying a folder of reports that would prompt inquiries, perhaps policy changes, maybe lawsuits, maybe nothing at all. The knowledge sat in me like a fossilized weight, undeniable, painful, and ordinary. If horror is a thing that happens to anyone, then this was it, quiet, procedural, and close enough to be real. The island looked smaller from the skiff than it had on the charts, an indifferent lump of rock and bleached driftwood crouched under a low, bruised sky. I told myself that was comfort. Maps shrink horrors into tiny coordinates. I told myself we were scientists, not trespassers in some private grief. The motor coughs died as we nosed onto a sliver of cobble, and I felt, immediately, the wrongness of a place that had been left to its own devices. The smell hit me first: salt, rot, and that curious sweetness of damp smoke. Someone had been here recently, or the island had been pretending it had. We had been sent by the Coastal Survey team to take water samples and to catalog any stray refuse. The island was marked on the log as uninhabited, a waypoint for migrating seals, a waypoint for nothing at all. The log's sterile handwriting did not prepare me for the makeshift cairn of stones when I climbed the short rise, an arrangement so deliberate it felt like a fist held up to the sky. There were footprints in the sand, half obliterated by wind, but still a rhythm, small, then large, then small again, as if two people had moved with a strange choreography. My chest went tight. On the top of the cairn someone had burned kelp until it was a blackened nest, and in the center lay a scrap of fabric, a shirt with a logo from a convenience store I recognized from the main highway back on the mainland. I knelt and the island gave me details as if it were testing whether I would notice: cigarette stubs pressed into a groove of rock, a single children's-sized sneaker buried mid-calf in old sand, initials carved into a driftwood plank that looked fresh, the exposed grain still damp. Each ordinary object read like evidence against some official story. I shoved my gloved fingers into the sand and felt the small, obscene intimacy of searching through someone else's abandonment. The rational checklist unfurled in my head: possible transient squatting, illegal anglers, a lost party, but beneath the logic was a quietly expanding dread that felt like ice sinking into marrow. That night I slept in the skiff, wrapped in a borrowed thermal blanket and an absurd conviction that if I kept my eyes closed long enough the island would fade from my mind. Instead it crowded every dream, faces I couldn't name, voices speaking in accents I couldn't place, laughter that stopped mid-phrase. In the dark the island's silhouette was a curved bruise against the moon. I thought I heard a shout carried thin over the water, or maybe it was the gulls. When the tide whispered up the hull it sounded, for a moment, like footsteps walking past a rock and continuing inland. Waking in the cold, my throat thick with a taste of copper, I told myself coastal winds play tricks. I told myself I was making a bigger story out of small details because loneliness amplifies fear. By morning we had found more traces. A battered cooler half buried that held dented cans and a damp notebook whose pages clung together. Inside were grocery lists, a hastily sketched map with excess, and entries in a neat hand: waiting for ride, fires at night keep things away, do not trust boat at mouth. I read them until the words blurred and my stomach dropped in sequential punches. The notebook was recent, ink that had not bled from long exposure, a pen loop still containing a plastic pen whose cap matched the brand of caps sold in a shelter near Anchorage. Each line asked a question with no neat answer: who courted this island shelter, and who had promised transport that never came? I began to imagine the island as an island of bargaining, a place people ended up when the world ran out of options. The images that rose were not grand or mythic, they were the small, terrifying negotiations of survival, promises made flesh, misconnections at bus stations, a call that never reached a number. I felt uncomfortably close to those missing coordinates because a friend of mine once disappeared for a week during a storm. He returned with a story skillet thin and evasive, and everyone who pressed him drifted away. The island asked me, quietly and persistently, whether I could tell the difference between a person who chose to vanish and a person whom systems had allowed to be lost. When we radioed the mainland, the reply came down flat and bureaucratic: report findings, maintain situational awareness, avoid interference. The voice on the other end sounded like a gate closing. We were told to leave samples and photographs and to return with a formal inventory. The order read like harmless paper, but it felt to me then like permission to let a place hold on to its tangled business. Alone on that spit of land, under a sky that had the color of old bruises, I found it harder to deny the possibility that the island had been used, purposely or by neglect, as a waypoint for people who had nowhere else to anchor. And if that were true, then the horror was not a rotting legend to be dismissed at dawn. It was an ordinary thing, procedural and banal and hideous, and I had stepped into the middle of it. We kept working because work is a small prayer against panic. We mapped the island in grids, cataloged each scrap, each nail, each imprint in the sand as if accurate enumeration could translate human absence back into sense. The notebook pages multiplied into a folder that smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. Someone had torn out a page and left the jagged edge like an accusation. The handwriting was tight, rational, then jittery: times, initials, a scroll, 3 nights, And no boat, he said tomorrow. The pronoun hovered like a suspended verdict. When the tide turned, it revealed a line of impressions running from the lee side of the island toward a cluster of low rocks, shoe prints, half-shaped by water, each step a stuttering story. Interstitial between them were drag marks, long, inconsistent gouges that spoke of something heavy being pulled over sand. My stomach clenched and I imagined the worst with a greedy clarity. I told myself to breathe, to photograph, to bag, to tag. I told myself that hypothesis precedes horror. But hypothesis is a brittle thing when you are alone with the evidence. It cracks into conjecture under the weight of what your hands have touched. That afternoon a local fisherman came by in a skiff, his face folded by sun and work into an expression I had seen in town, equal parts exhaustion and calculation. He listened to our description, spat tobacco overboard, and then said, "People use that rock as a last stop." He said it like a fact about the tide. He told us not to poke too hard. Islands like that have reasons for themselves. When I pressed him, asked whether boats came and left without records, whether people had known routes that weren't on official maps, his eyes slid away. "You don't ask too many questions, kid," he said, and the way his hands tightened on the oars looked like a small, private warning. That night, exhausted and restless, I sat near the cairn with the notebook open on my knees. The wind knifed across the hollow of the island and the pages flapped like a trapped bird. I thought of the carved initials and the child's sneaker, of the burnt kelp nest. There was a rhythm to it that felt human and small, someone making shelter, someone leaving a sign, someone failing to keep a promise. Yet under the ordinary pattern lay a rub. The island's utility as a place to disappear required not force but the softer violence of indifference. No single crime screamed from the sand. The transgression was quieter, systemic, a missed bus, a closed shelter, a misdialed phone. That realization was more monstrous than any ghost I might invent. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of walking lines of footprints that never led to answers. I woke certain I had heard a voice call a name and then doubted whether the sound had come from the sea or my own memory. In the brittle dawn I found something new, a length of rope partially buried, frayed at one end, knotted with the clumsy care of someone hurried. It had hair clinging to the fibers. My hands trembled as I lifted it. The rope smelled faintly of diesel and sweat. A procedural part of me recorded chain of custody, photographed, packaged. A human part recoiled at the intimacy of what my gloved fingers had brushed. We radioed for the Coast Guard. The reply was delayed and then bureaucratic. Send coordinates, maintain safety, do not interfere with potential evidence. Their language was careful, not unkind, but it felt like a membrane between two worlds. While we waited, the island began to yield fragments that made the hypothesis harder to shrug off. A discarded ID card laminated but waterlogged, a pill bottle with a label from a clinic 300 miles away, a photograph of two people laughing, edges softened but the eyes still sharp. Each object was a person remade into an artifact, a life reduced to items that could be cataloged and boxed. When the Coast Guard arrived, they moved with that particular professional detachment that has been honed to keep responders sane. They looped yellow tape, took measurements, made calls. A senior officer asked me in a soft, precise way what we had found and whether we had any reason to suspect foul play. I answered with the practiced restraint I'd been taught in field work: describe, do not narrate, observe, do not infer. But later that night, when he thought the rest of his team had left the makeshift command, he told me something in a voice low enough that the gulls could not carry it. We see this a lot. Not always violence. Sometimes it's abandonment. Sometimes it's bad luck. But sometimes, he stopped and looked at the shoreline as if it might cough up an answer. Sometimes they get stuck out there with no way back and nobody notices until the weather changes. I wanted to hate him for saying what I already feared. Instead, I felt a sick empathy, a recognition that the island functioned as a scene where human systems frayed and people slipped through. The horror hardened in me like ice on a wound. It wasn't that somebody had committed a monstrous act on that rock. it was that the world had quietly assembled the conditions for people to become stranded and invisible. Each item we bagged was a footprint of that careful negligence. The island was not a monstrous intent but a ledger of omission, and ledger is a dull instrument for grief. The helpline number on the back of my notebook rang like an accusation the morning the larger boat came. Men in heavy coats moved with the steadiness of people trained to swallow horror whole and file it away. They took custody of the evidence, stacked our plastic bags into crates stamped with codes, and promised notifications that felt like talismans against panic. A woman from social services asked me to sit and answer questions about timelines. Her calm voice trembled at the edges, not from fear but from the knowledge that the answers might not fix anything. When I told her about the child's sneaker and the rope with hair, her jaw tightened as if she had tasted something bitter she could not spit out. The autopsy results were clinical in cruelty, exposure, hypothermia, dehydration, a cocktail of small failures culminating in death. No blunt force, no definitive assault, only the tragically ordinary causes that follow being cut off from help. The laboratory returned a faded gym membership card and a phone number that led to a voicemail box with 3 missed messages and a final, panicked whisper, "Please, I'm here. I'm waiting." Listening to that recording made my hands go cold. The voice was neither mythical nor monstrous, only human and unbearably ordinary. As the weeks folded into bureaucratic rhythms, incident reports, press briefings that framed the island as transient encampment, meetings about outreach, something inside me broke into a sharper shape. The narrative being offered to the public was tidy, a cautionary tale about trespassing, about coastal hazards. It washed over the real vectors of harm, poverty, failed transit, shelters at capacity, a coastline that offered refuge by default and abandonment by design. Officials used phrases like mitigate risk and community resources while families were left to stitch explanations together from catalog numbers and shipping manifests. The horror was procedural, people transformed into problems to be managed and then archived. I went back to the can the night before I left. The island was quieter than the map suggested, save for the surf low and constant like an impatient heartbeat. I sat on the burned kelp and thumbed the carved initials until the wood rubbed smooth under my finger. The smell of salt and smoke clung to me. I imagined the life of the person whose pen had written waiting for ride, small humiliations, a litany of missed buses, a string of promises that dissolved in rain. I imagined them choosing the island because it offered a margin where someone might find you, a place between worlds where help might stumble across you or where you might simply disappear less conspicuously than on a highway shoulder. There were moments when the island's silence felt like a deliberate thing, as if some unseen intelligence had laid a trap. In those moments my mind gifted me specters, plots and predators, supernatural frames that made fear shapely. But when I stripped away the cinematic instincts and looked at the evidence, the terror hardened into something human and recognizable, systems that fail the vulnerable, slow mechanical violences that accumulate until a person is left stranded. That realization was colder than any imagined monster. It offered no clean villain, no catharsis, only the ugly arithmetic of neglect. On the last dawn I photographed the cairn one more time. The light flattened the island into components, stone, driftwood, a smudge of footprints. I left the skiff and the island receded into a horizon that looked indifferent and honest, the kind of landscape that neither hides nor vindicates. Back on the mainland the press called, and we wrote careful statements emphasizing ongoing cooperation. The notebook went into evidence, my notes into a binder, names into forms. Eventually there were outreach programs and a small fund for better transport along the coast. People nodded at meetings and filled out surveys. Maybe some things changed. Maybe they did not. The horror did not evaporate with policy memos. It sat in me like grit behind the teeth, persistent, uncomfortable, needing to be spat out. I kept thinking of the voice on that voicemail and the sound of someone listing ordinary items as if they were a litany. If there is an after for the island, it is not supernatural reckoning but the slow possibility of repair, better transit, accountable shelters, people watching for each other. Until systems change, ordinary places will continue to be sites where the vulnerable become invisible. That is the cruel, plausible truth, and it is far worse than any ghost I could have feared. The poles ran like a stitch seam through the tundra, a brittle spine of iron and wire that had held the country together long before GPS and satellites made routes polite. I had been hired to restore a segment of an old telegraph line that had been abandoned for decades, an odd preservation contract, someone's nostalgic project, so I drove north until pavement dissolved into gravel and foam bars winked out like polite lies. The sky was a pale bruise, the land smelled of rust and diesel and the distant salt of the sea. I told myself I was there for the work, replace insulators, tension the wire, document the rhythm of decay. That professional script sagged quickly under the cold. The first pole I climbed creaked like an old throat. When I reached the crossarm, my gloved hand brushed against a coil of slack wire tied in a crude loop. It was not the wire that made the back of my neck prickle, but the fact that someone had threaded paper into the loop, once neat, now ragged postcards folded, weather-creased, with blacked-out names and what looked like codes scratched across them in hurried ink. My stomach turned at the intimacy of it, as if I had found someone's private notes wedged in a prayer book. I unrolled one and read fragments, dates, place names, a sequence of dots and dashes that matched the old telegraph patterns we'd been restoring. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, the spoils of kids playing ghost with old tech. But the handwriting was adult, the pen cheap but steady. The pages smelled faintly of mildewed paper and something metallic beneath, like old pennies kept in someone's fist. Down the line the poles accumulated other things, lengths of ribbon, a glove with cut fingers, a small child's button whose paint had flaked away into a constellation of blue. Some items were ordinary losses, others felt placed with intention, as if someone used the poles to deposit pieces of a life too awkward to carry further. I collected them in a plastic bag more out of habit than hope, the way archaeologists scoop up shards and tell themselves meaning will come with cataloging. Each object was a whisper of some human economy, gifts, losses, messages, and together they made a vocabulary I couldn't immediately translate. That evening, after the sun had been excised from the horizon and a wind came down from the north that sounded like fabric tearing, I sat with my thermos and the postcards laid between my knees. The dots and dashes danced in my head like a pulse. I tapped them out on the bench in rhythm without thinking, and for the first time the code answered back, an old trick of the mind, an echo. Or maybe it was the transmitter on my bench picking up a stray carrier. The rational explanations crowded in like vulture facts, radio bleed, sympathetic resonance, pranksters. But with each plausible reason, another itch of dread grew. The postcards bore dates that lined up with missing person notices I remembered from back home, names I had once skimmed in town bulletins and quickly discarded. Coincidence seemed a fragile scaffold. As darkness thickened, I thought I heard a signal from the line itself, a faint click like a metronome far away, then silence. I stood and walked the path between the poles listening, boots sinking into wet moss that left a copper smell on my hands. The night was enormous and indifferent, stars hollowed out like watchful teeth. Every 100 yards the poles punctured the air with their mechanical geometry, and with every step I felt a pressure building inside me that was not just cold. In the far distance lights from a service road winked, and for a dizzying second I imagined voices carried by the wires, messages folded into old technology, waiting like trapped birds. I told myself this was ridiculous, that meaning is a human hunger that bends random things into patterns. Still, my fingers kept seeking the postcards in my jacket pocket as if their touch could answer the loosened knot inside my chest. We kept working the line because the job has a logic that demands completion: climb, tighten, solder, record. Doing the mundane acted like an anesthetic against the small revolutions in my head. Still, the postcards gnawed at me. I started matching dates to reports I pulled from the station's battered database, and between 2 cups of instant coffee and freezing hands I found overlaps, towns, last seen notices, a runaway filed away with a shrug. Each match tightened a hand around my throat until my breath sounded foreign in my ears. One afternoon, a truck with county plates rolled up and a man in a canvas coat stepped out with the kind of smile that hides calculation. He asked questions about how long the poles had been maintained, whether I'd found anything odd. I showed him the postcards because lying felt like joining a conspiracy. He skimmed them and his face slackened into a blank that wasn't compassion. It was the practiced neutrality of someone who had been taught how to close a file. Local kids put things on the poles, he said, as if repeating it enough would make it true. He left a card with a number and told me to file a report if I was worried. The number felt like punctuation, a full stop against the sentence I was trying to write. That night I rigged a small recorder near a cluster of poles. The wind ate at the wires and the recorder caught it all, the snap of cold, a distant coyote, the metallic cough of a transmission wheel, but layered beneath the ambient noise there was a pattern, a faint tapping, irregular but deliberate. It could have been branches against wire, ice contracting, a truck far down the service road. I played it back until my eyes burned and the tapping became words my tired brain wanted to believe. As the hours piled up, the rational explanations buckled under the weight of my attention. I began to imagine messages threaded through the wire, cries, coordinates, attempts to be seen. Sleep thinned into something that looked like dusk. I started seeing shapes at the periphery of the poles while I walked the line, human silhouettes that dissolved when I focused, footprints half erased by dew. Once I found fresh cigarette butts aligned along a pole like a neat row of tiny graves. My hands trembled as I bagged them. The anxiety was granular, small, accumulating details that together made an edifice of dread. I felt haunted by possibility. The postcard's handwriting had become more than ink, it was an accusation. Each dot and dash I traced matched the rhythm of my own pulse. A week in, I found a buried tin under a leaning pole. Inside were photographs, a folded bus ticket to a city 300 miles south, and a note in cramped script, left here. Waited 4 days. Boat didn't come. Take the line if you can. The photographs were of faces smiling into other lives, birthdays, a graduation, a backyard barbecue, and the backs had names I recognized from the missing person ledger. The discovery collapsed into me like a cave-in. I drove to town and confronted the municipal office with the tin in my hands, my breath loud and shameful. They listened with the kind of procedural courtesy reserved for people who want not to be troubled. We have limited resources, one woman said. We close cases if there's no evidence of foul play. Her voice was flat, and in it I heard an industry of deflection. After that conversation, the wires became accusatory. I walked the line at night, feeling watched by forces that were not supernatural but perhaps worse, paperwork and the slow churn of human systems that choose what to notice. I started sleeping with the recorder on and the postcards beneath my pillow because logic had ceded ground to superstition. I wanted proof, even if it arrived in a small, banal form. The tape captured traffic and wind, and then, clearer than the rest, a voice on a carrier frequency, ragged and distant, saying a name I had read in a missing persons file. I rewound it until the hiss infiltrated my skull. I could rationalize it away, spurious radio, a prank, but the tape was a rude, physical thing I could hold. It was a handprint in evidence. That night the poles felt like witnesses whose silence was a choice. I pictured operators decades ago tapping codes into the cold with the same deft fingers of necessity, then imagined people handing messages to the wire like paper birds, desperate for direction. The more I tried to maintain professional distance, the more the line pulled me into intimacy with those ghosts of bureaucracy. I started answering the postcards in my head, tapping back in code that meant nothing to anyone but me. The horror wasn't in the possibility of monsters, it lay in the bureaucratic silence, the thin margin where a human can vanish because no one is mandated to look harder. The last week shredded the distance between me and the wire until I could no longer tell which one was conducting whom. I carried the tin and the postcards like contraband and listened to the town speak in legalisms and tired faces. Meetings produced forms, forms produced silence. A detective I cornered in a corridor said, without malice, that resources dictate attention, cold arithmetic delivered with the warmth of inevitability. His shrug was a verdict. The polls, the tape, the photographs all became evidence that someone could shelve and forget. I started sleeping less and walking more, tracing the line in the hours just before dawn when the world feels most vulnerable. The polls threw long, accusing shadows, and the air tasted of iron. At one point I found footprints leading off the service track into a stand of alders, small and cautious, like someone testing whether they could be unseen. The footprints stopped by a rusted junction box where the paint had been scorched away. Inside the box was a folded scrap of calendar page with a scroll, a time, an abbreviation for a town, a phone number with 3 missed calls. My throat closed around the word impossible and then around grief. That scrap had been placed there to be found or to be returned, either way it had been a plea. I pressed harder with my questions and the town pressed back with procedures. A county supervisor arranged for a sweep, a polite convoy that moved through the line taking photographs and measurements, then leading with neat spreadsheets and a promise to reassess outreach. They took the tin, lauded its contents, and smiled the smile of people who know bad things and keep them tidy. In a debriefing, a social worker said the word abandonment like a diagnosis and suggested services that might have helped if they had been deployed in time. The language warmed nothing, it only cataloged what had already been cataloged: failure. Late one night I played the recorder back on a loop until the voices on it were a litany. There was the earlier click and then, unmistakably, a breath and a name, clear, human, hopeless. I sat with the device until dawn and then drove the coordinates the voice suggested, following a map stitched together from postcards and tin. The trail ended at a culvert under a forgotten county road, half swallowed by brush and braided with the smell of diesel and urine. Inside, under damp insulation, were blankets, wrappers, a ruined pack, and a photograph stuck to a stone with a thumbprint I recognized from the tin. It was a life reduced to objects in a drainage ditch. I wanted to scream, but the sound would only return my own terror. We did not find a murderer. We found neglect, rust, missed shifts, a bus that never arrived, a number that went unanswered. We assembled narratives from the detritus, a failed escape, a promise that dissolved in weather, a person who walked the line looking for a hand that never came. The final reports used cautious verbs, likely, possible, presumed, and in those verbs the horror settled like a film on glass, not a sensational monster but a slow, social erasure. The telegraph poles had been a bulletin board for desperation, the wires had been a poor infrastructure for pleas. When the county published their review they recommended outreach and funding, and for a while meetings convened. Meetings convened like tributes and then, gradually, moved on. I left the polls with a fury that tasted like rust and shame. The postcards stayed with me longer than the taste. At night the old rhythms of dots and dashes would pulse in my temples until I could nearly hear the tapping of fingers that had never been answered. Sometimes I imagined a timeline in which someone had replied, where a rescue came before hypothermia and desperation. Those imagined rescues were merciful lies. The truth was more banal and corrosive. People vanish not because of monsters but because of systems that do not care enough to look, because logistics and indifference conspire into something that feels indistinguishable from malice. The terror that lived in me afterwards was secular and intimate. It was less the cinematic dread of a hidden beast and more the quiet, accumulating horror of discovery, of learning that a thread of iron and a ledger of apathy could swallow a life. That understanding was a cold thing, plausible, ordinary, and therefore more terrifying. I kept the recorder and the tin in a box that lives in the back of my closet. Sometimes I take them out and listen, and the voice on the tape is still only a human sound, fragile and pleading. And I still walk by the poles when I can, not because I expect to find ghosts, but because I am trying, clumsily and belatedly, to answer the taps that used to go unanswered. The fog came like a bruise rolling across the highway, a slow, monstrous swell that swallowed the world outside my windshield. One moment the road was there, yellow bars, reflectors flashing, and the next everything beyond the hood was a flat, opaque thing the color of dirty milk. My breath fogged the glass in short, panic bursts. The heater rattled as if trying to tell me something I refused to hear. I had driven these stretches 100 times, but that familiarity turned traitor when the instruments on the dash began to hiccup. The GPS spun like a tiny, desperate top. The fuel gauge dipped a hair and climbed back as if indecisive. The radio scratched static as though someone had folded the sky into a whisper. The sensation was small at first, a pinprick of wrongness behind my eyes, but it widened until my skull felt like a drum. I pulled over to the shoulder out of habit and professional caution, but the shoulder had become soft with frost and the tires left prints that bled away into the fog. My phone had one bar and refused my calls. When I stepped outside, the air hit my face with a metallic tang, sharp, almost sweet in a way that made my tongue tingle, and somewhere in my chest a small animal panic began to misread my fear as motion. I unscrewed a sample vial from my kit with fingers that trembled despite the gloves and lifted it to the air. The inside of the vial fogged immediately, then cleared. The mouth of the bottle smelled faintly of iron and old batteries. I told myself it was sensor error, temperature differentials, nothing more than nature being capricious. But the taste of the air stayed in me like a promise, odd, specific, unnerving. I stayed, because staying felt like acting rather than fleeing. I took measurements and recordings, each timestamp a totem against the feeling that whatever was happening wanted to be unnamed. My handheld monitor registered minute fluctuations in barometric pressure and a spike of particulate that the device flagged, anomalous, worth marking. I bagged a swab of the roadside and sealed it. Then, because my hands would not stop moving, I took another, deeper sample from the ditch where the fog seemed to pool. The cotton pulled back damp and slick, as if the ground had been part of the fog's skin. Back in the cab, my fingers left wet crescents on the vinyl. The sound of the heater was too loud, the world amplified to obscene clarity. By late afternoon a headache had settled behind my eyes, slow and insistent, as if a hand pressed there with patient cruelty. At first I blamed the cold, then the stress of a long survey, then bad sleep. My vision blurred at the edges like ink feathering on paper. I tightened my jaw against nausea and told myself not to be dramatic. But then the radio, dead for hours, popped and a voice bled through, thin and tinny and full of static, saying a word that was almost my name. I froze, the hairs on my arm prickling until it felt like pins were driving into my skin. The voice could have been my fatigue translating noise into pattern. It could have been anything. My rational mind made a list of excuses while a quieter, weirder part of me cataloged possibilities that had no category. Night fell without ceremony and the fog wrapped the truck like a shroud. Headlights painted the world into hard, short arcs and then nothing. Outside the beam the white haze reasserted itself with an appetite. I tried to call the office and the line went dead. I tried to signal a passing car and only a distant, indistinct pulse answered, maybe a truck, maybe a glitch in my perception. The thermometer on the dash showed a steady drop, and somewhere below the shudder of the engine I detected a new sound, a low, rhythmic pop, like old piping settling, like someone far away tapping out a code with gloved knuckles. The sound made the hair on my neck stand up into a corridor of fear. I told myself not to panic. I wrote in my field journal with an effort of will, neat, clinical lines that began to tremble halfway down the page. The samples I collected that day looked ordinary enough under my hand lens, a fine dust, grains that glittered dull in the light. But when I ran the handheld spectrometer, more out of ritual than hope, it spit back a set of readings with labels I didn't expect, volatile organics, traces of nitrogenous compounds, a fingerprint that matched neither road dust nor common industrial plumes. The device flagged them as unusual and advised laboratory confirmation. I felt my throat fill with a cold thick as oil. Unusual meant explainable. Explainable meant somebody's negligence, or worse, a plausible human horror. My symptoms deepened, dizziness at the edges, the way my ears clogged and then unclogged with a soft pop like a secret being revealed. For a while I told myself it was stress manifesting, the mind playing theater with small anxieties. For a while I trusted scientific method as an incantation against fear. But the fog outside didn't care for method. It just sat there, patient and indifferent, and in the long, oppressive calm I began to wonder whether the things we catalog as anomalies are not anomalies at all but warnings misread as background noise. The thought lodged in me like a splinter. What if this was something human, a slow, industrial horror leaking into the places we thought remote, a danger that could find any of us stranded and small? I told myself to document everything, to behave like an instrument, observe, log, label, but the instruments were starting to argue with me. The handheld readings jittered in ways I couldn't rationalize, spikes that arrived without a source, a low-frequency hum that the audio recorder picked up as a wave of static, and then, for a half-second, silence so complete it felt like being plunged underwater. My pulse matched the irregularity. Each false certainty was replaced by a new, more corrosive question. I drove back to the nearest maintenance shack and paced its fluorescent light, watching the device screen splash numbers I could not make peace with. The technician shrugged and said the gear was old, calibration could be off. His shrug sounded like dismissal shaped as expertise. That evening I went back out, because leaving felt like abandonment and because staying felt like a duty to whatever ghost of evidence I might uncover. The fog had thickened into a skin so dense my headlights shoveled through it like blunt knives. My radio crackled and a voice, thin, urgent, told me to avoid the low ground near mile marker 32. The transmission was clipped, the accent uncertain, the plea threaded with static and hung up before I could reply. I tuned until my ears bled. The frequency gave back nothing but hiss. Whoever had spoken was gone, or disconnected, or deliberately anonymous. The warning lodged like a barbed thought. Someone else had noticed and cared enough to speak, and then they were gone. I started to feel physical effects that no checklist prepared for. My chest tightened into a vice and I sweated under my jacket though my skin prickled with cold. My hands trembled when I opened sample bags. The cotton swabs left faint, oily smudges on the plastic. Once, staring at the smear under harsh LED, I imagined that the sample moved like a tiny animal under the magnification, an absurd hallucination, but the image clung. Sleep became fragmented and gilded with invasive certainty. I dreamed I was driving and the road dissolved into white, and when I woke my mouth tasted of metal and a name I'd never known threaded itself through my thoughts like a new song. The county started asking questions. A supervisor arrived with a lawyer who folded certainty into legal language and told me to avoid speculative comments in my logs. Their presence felt like a net closing, not to catch truth but to keep it manageable. They wanted raw data, nothing narrative, because narratives made people angry and angry people asked for things, change, accountability, answers. I resented the solicitor's measured calm with a heat that surprised me. Their composure looked like complicity. I began to suspect that the fog, the readings, even the strange transmissions were less likely to be random and more likely to be the product of something controlled, an experiment gone sloppy, a contractor cutting corners, an industrial effluent venting where no one expected it to. The thought was both terrible and banal. Late one night my recorder captured a conversation between two men I did not know, arguing about limits and coverage and whether a shutdown would cost too much in overtime. The recording was garbled, but the gist was unmistakable. People were talking about safety as a budgetary line item, not a moral imperative. I listened until a nausea like guilt rose in my throat. The sound of their indifferent voices was worse than any monstrous howl. It meant the danger might be preventable and was not being prevented. It meant the horror was a ledger entry away from existence. Driving back to the truck after stowing evidence felt like moving through a dream where every landmark had been rearranged. At the ditch I had sampled earlier I found footprints I did not recognize, large, heavy, with tread that suggested industrial boots. Next to them lay a metal canister half buried, its label peeled away. When I pried it free, the scent that rose was sharp and chemical, a sting at the back of the eyes that made tears come without sorrow. My stomach revolted. I felt suddenly, acutely, how small and porous a human body is when exposed to something designed without concern. The canister rattled like a sleeper waking. For a sliver of time I imagined a conspiracy, clandestine disposal, corporate greed wrapped in a veil of plausible deniability. The hypothesis fit too well, like a smooth stone into a dark pocket. My nights dissolved into looped anxiety. I invited a colleague to come out and confirm what I had found. He arrived with skepticism I envied. He shrugged when I showed him the canister and the tape, then watched the spectrometer read the same odd signatures I had seen. His brow darkened and he stopped smiling in the way people do when they realize the world they thought reliable has a brittle underside. Together we sampled deeper into the ditch, and under the muck we found fabric fused to metal, like clothing melted to the thing that had killed it. The image lodged in me with the intimacy of a confession, a person, a jacket, a life, and then, fused to an industrial object, as if someone's attempt to survive had been eaten by negligence. I heard myself say the word horror out loud, and it came out not as a flourish but as a fact. They brought vans and men in vests that smelled of coffee and authority, and for a while I mistook motion for meaning. The county set up a cordon, the lab took samples with sterile gloves, and the company whose logo I'd seen on the canister issued a statement that sounded like an apology written by a committee. Meetings happened in rooms with bad coffee and better intentions. Slides showed projected timelines and mitigations and promised audits. In the tidy language of those rooms, the ditch became a contamination event and people became stakeholders. The vocabulary softened the edges of what we'd found until it could be managed without moral discomfort. But soft language could not unmake the things under the mud. The autopsy reports confirmed what the fused fabric suggested: exposure to chemicals consistent with solvents and combustion, organ failure in patterns that matched the signatures we'd measured. There were no cinematic villains, no masked saboteurs, only a slow, bureaucratic neglect, expired storage permits, a maintenance schedule that skipped a site every third month, a contract clause that allowed contractors to dispose of waste at alternative sites. The horror crystallized in the small bureaucratic loopholes, in the memo that read like permission to be careless. My anger, when it came, was as precise as it was cold. It burned into me like a brand. Families called looking for names. Some calls were soft with grief, others edged with the brittle anger of people who had spent years filing reports and not being heard. I drove to one address, a trailer with peeling paint, and a woman opened the door and held a photograph out to me. The face in the picture was alive and laughing. In the ditch 3 weeks earlier I had seen that same smile taped to wet insulation. She asked me why nobody had come sooner. I said things about process and evidence, and each word was a small, unsatisfactory salve. The sentence there was simple and clean in its cruelty. The system's slowness was lethal. As the investigations unfolded, there were hearings and denials and a scattering of charges against managers who had looked the other way. There were settlements that smelled faintly of avoidance. For a while the company sent technicians to replace tarps and retrofit storage, and inspectors came with clipboards to tick boxes. The fog receded as if it had never been systemic at all, whether moving through the landscape with indifferent choreography, yet the chemical signatures persisted in the soil like a stain you can't bleach out with good intentions. The town accepted donations and speeches and then resumed its rhythms. Life folded back into the usual miseries that are less dramatic and therefore easier to ignore. At night I still dream of the fog. The sound of the tape, the low-frequency hum and that ragged voice, recurs like a punishment. I imagine hands in the ditch, fumbling for a phone that has no signal, a mouth that needs to scream but finds only a cough. I picture the catalog forms stacked in a county office and wonder how many names will ever translate into real protection. Sometimes the fear in me turns into a precise, burning urgency. I must tell people, change procedures, demand inspections. Other times it curls inward and becomes a cold acceptance that systems rarely change quickly enough to save the next person. The most corrosive thing is how easily doubt worms into memory. There were nights when, alone in the truck, I could feel my rational mind slip, vivid imaginings of a fog that moves like a living thing, of hands that pull at axles and wires, of malevolent intent in the geometry of white. The cinematic version is easier to narrate, cleaner to fear. But when I strip it down, the terror is ordinary, bureaucratic, greed, cost-cutting, oversight, laxness. It is the plausible cruelty of human systems choosing efficiency over life. That truth is quieter and harsher than a ghost. I kept the recorder in the specimen canister. I filed my notes in a box labeled in neat ink, Incident 47. Sometimes I take them out and listen, and the tape gives back a voice that is neither demon nor omen, just a human being who tried to warn and was not heard. The scar the event left on the surrounding land is measurable, written into soil assays and regulatory appendices. The scar it left in me is less neat, a permanent attention to small anomalies, a suspicion that when instruments sing wrong things we must listen harder, and the knowledge that horror can be as banal as a budgetary line item. If there is a moral at all, it is this: the worst things that can happen to us are often the ones we create through negligence and indifference. The fog was not a monster out of storybooks. The horror was human hands making choices that made danger possible and then pretending the choices were accidents. That realization is worse than any supernatural explanation because it means the hazard could happen again, anywhere, to anyone. The tape keeps me honest. I answer when it taps.